The Russian conventional military can't begin to contend with a 32-state NATO alliance with long borders with the Russian Federation, military technology that really is beyond what Russia can offer, and economies and populations that dwarf Russia's overall. And he can't contend with that threat by winning in Ukraine or conquering NATO member states. He's going to have to reach some sort of understanding with the West. And if he can't, then Russia is going to have to rely on its nuclear arsenal to a much greater degree than it has. I think we're probably headed toward a situation, if we don't reach some sort of understanding between the West and Russia on all this, where Europe is renuclearized.
Howdy, everyone, and welcome back to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and this week it is just me. Nick has a bouncing baby boy on the way, and so I am holding down the fort here. It has been a crazy couple of weeks between helping host National Conservatism Conference, being at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania on Saturday. If you'd like to see my reflections on that, I've written a piece at Unheard about it, to being at the RNC and watching our good friend J.D. Vance be named the vice presidential nominee for President Trump. It's been an awesome few weeks. We are back to work here in Washington, D.C., however, getting prepared to send thousands of people, hopefully, into the next administration, into congressional offices and into public policy organizations. Come say hello. We have a brand new office, and we're excited to host all of you. As always, you can see everything else we have cooking at AmericanMoment.org, the backlog of this podcast, all of our upcoming programs, AM Fridays, and more. But this week we had on a fantastic new guest, someone who teaches for us all the time. Really, having him on has been way overdue. We had on George Beebe, who spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as director of the CIA's Russia Analysis Department, director of CIA's Open Source Center, and a staff advisor on Russia Matters to Vice President Dick Cheney. Now, that resume may lead you to believe that we had on some deep state crank. No, George is actually very aligned with an agenda of realism and restraint, one of the most sober-minded foreign policy voices in Washington. His book, The Russia Trap, How Our Shadow War with Russia Could Spiral into Nuclear Catastrophe, was published by St. Martin's Press in 2019. And it warned how the United States and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. Prior to joining the Quincy Institute, he was the vice president and director of studies at the Center for the National Interest, and before that served as a president of a technology company that measured the impact of events, issue, and advertising campaigns on audience views. He speaks Russian and German. George and I talked about the 75th anniversary of NATO, what the future of this Russia-Ukraine war might look like, his sort of sociological analysis of the deep state in Washington, and what he's afraid of coming up in the members-only segment. In order to become a member, you can go to YouTube and you can become either a truther or a statesman in order to get these episodes 24 hours early, as well as seeing these special members-only segments we do. Thank you to everyone who's been subscribing. It's been a joy to see that steadily tick up week over week. It really helps us subsidize this show and everything here we're doing at American Moment. We'll go now to George Beebe, the director of the Grand Strategy program at the Quincy Institute now. George, thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We always like to hear about how our guests got to where they are today. Your resume lines would lead one to assume that you are a partisan of realism and restraint. Tell us the story of your career and how you ended up where you are today.
Well, largely accidentally, believe it or not. Back when I was in high school, I'm from New England. My dad was working for one of the national laboratories, MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And I came home from school one day and he said, guess what? We're moving to the Marshall Islands, which I thought was a terrible idea. Never heard of the place, didn't know where it was. I had to go look on my globe. But this was where the United States had a missile testing range. So they would launch missiles from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. They'd land in the lagoon in Kwajalein Atoll. And my dad was a radar guy, so the radar guys would track these missiles coming in. So I was sort of forced to go live out there with the family. And one of the immediate things that I noticed was that the Soviet Union had a ship that used to patrol offshore of this atoll. It was an intelligence collection ship. They were collecting telemetry data from the missile shots that were coming in. So it's all done above board under the terms of the arms control treaties we had with the Soviet Union. But my friends and I would go out surfing and fishing and scuba diving, and we could see this ship and we would wave to the sailors and they would wave back. And it got me interested in, what is this whole Soviet thing? What is the arms race and all that? So I studied this in school just out of interest, not out of any professional ambition. And
was the degree called Sovietology at the time?
Well, it wasn't exactly called Sovietology, but I specialized in Soviet foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I was in the course of one of my graduate courses, it was team taught by a guy that used to work at the CIA. And he approached me after class one day and said, "Hey, have you ever thought of working at the CIA?" And I said, "No." "And why are you talking to me?" And, but he said, "No, you got to look into it. A bunch of very good people. And I think we study things very similar to what we're doing in class. And I think you ought to investigate it." So I did, and the agency gave me a job offer. It's the only job offer I got, so it was easy to make that decision, and I sort of went from there.
Tell me about what that's like. Like, what does an entry-level job at the CIA entail, and demystify a little bit of what that's like for our audience.
Right. Well, I was in the analysis part of CIA, so there are people that collect information overseas. They're what people think about when they see the Hollywood movies. Yeah. That's right. And then there are the people that sort of sit and think about the dynamics of what's going on in different parts of the world. Their job is to anticipate threats, identify opportunities, help policymakers understand the situations that they're dealing with, understand the dynamics of those situations, and understand where those other countries are coming from. What are they trying to do? What are they trying to accomplish? What constraints do they work within? So that's the job of what the analyst does. Basically, you try to separate fact from allegation about any given situation in the world. You try to understand the other countries' perspectives on the United States and on the situations they're dealing with. And you try to look into the future to the degree that's really possible. What's coming down the road? And CIA was, of course, created as a result of Pearl Harbor. It was created to warn about threats to this country so that we can manage and hopefully avoid them. So that was what the analyst does. And so, I was hired as a Soviet foreign policy analyst, and I started out looking at Soviet policy in the Middle East. And it was fascinating. Intellectually, I found it very challenging and very stimulating. And I liked the people I was working with. And that, of course, is very important in any job. You want to be working with people that you enjoy and appreciate and respect. And I think that was certainly true for me.
So after you left CIA, where'd you go?
Well, I went into the private sector. I first worked with an open source analytic unit that was basically offering open source analysis back to the government because there's an awful lot of information that is now available in the internet era. And to exploit that, you need to know how to find it, how to collect it. You need to have the language capability to interpret it. And so I did that for a little while. I then joined a technology company that was developing technology to understand how audiences were reacting to various kinds of online content. That included strategic communications campaigns of varying purposes. Some of them were political, some were simply advertising.
Yeah. I'm having all sorts of flashbacks of news events in the 2010s
now. Right. Well, coincidentally, one of the things that happened was the 2016 election, the allegations of Russian meddling, as they called it at the time. And I got a call from some people that I knew back from my government days that were running a foreign affairs journal and think tank, the National Interest. And they said, "Hey, You know Russia, you know technology, you know strategic communications campaigns. Would you be interested in writing about this whole, what we know in retrospect is Russiagate now? And I asked my board of directors, they said, sure, go for it. So I wrote a piece, got published, and eventually that think tank said, hey, we'd like to have you come on board. We ended up selling the company, and I said, you can have as much of my time as you want. And that was my transition into the world of foreign affairs think tank work.
And what about your time with Vice President Cheney during all this?
Well, yeah, that was a fascinating time for me. I was at CIA at the time. I had done some rotations to the State Department as a diplomat, helping to negotiate some conventional arms control agreements. I came back and was head of CIA's Russian foreign policy analysis group. And the vice president had a need for a Russia expert. And they offered me the job, and that was a very interesting time. This was prior to the Iraq War. It was a time when the United States and Russia were attempting to build what we called a strategic partnership. There was a lot of desire on both parts to cooperate against common threats such as terrorism, and to work together in partnership on a lot of issues in the world. And so,
would you say that was a local maxima in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, I think certainly I saw during my time at the White House the peak of the U.S.-Russian effort to build that kind of partnership. And I also watched it erode over time and had an opportunity to understand why we ran into the problems that we did. But over the course of my time there, we went from very high hopes for that partnership to deep concerns that we were on a trajectory toward growing hostility in the relationship. And I think, obviously, in retrospect, that downward trajectory has continued to the point where we're now almost on the brink of direct war between our countries.
So it's interesting, the seasons that you've been involved in American foreign policy, the right and left valence of the American relationship with Russia has changed over that time. And in recent years, especially, we've seen the left become very, very hostile and hawkish towards Russia. I'm just curious how you reflect on how the partisanship of America's foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia has changed over time.
Well, you're right. It's been quite dramatic. Back early in my career, the left was associated with a pro-détente, pro-diplomacy stance, anti-arms race. Can't we all just get along? The peace movement vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And the right was associated with a tougher approach. Certainly, détente had its heyday under the Nixon administration and Ford. Carter continued that to some degree. But by and large, I think the right was considered a harder line toward the Soviet Union, and the left was more of a pro-détente approach. I think that's really changed. I think we're now at the point where the Democratic Party is quite hostile toward Russia, not just to the degree that they think we ought to contain Russian influence and power in the world, but they have adopted a position that I think is quite similar to the hardest of the hardliners in the early post-Cold War period, the rollback faction of the Republican Party that believed we ought to roll back Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. And they're going, not only to rollback, but to actual potentially regime change and breakup of the Russian Federation today. That's a position that would have been extreme, even among the right-wing hardliners early in the Cold War period. Now, why? I think part of it is ideological. Part of it is the result of a belief that the United States not only won the Cold War and demonstrated the superiority of its system, but that we have an obligation to spread that system, to evangelize liberal democracy in the world, and bring that to other countries, whether they like it or not. And I think the left has latched on to that approach to foreign policy, and you see this on all kinds of issues, not just toward Russia. And I think the other thing that's happened is domestic electoral politics. I think the left, to a great degree, blamed Russia for what happened in the 2016 election. And they're quite loath to forgive the Russians or to try to find some modus vivendi, because they believe that Russia, in its support, as they see it, for Donald Trump in 2016, poses a grave threat to our country and to our values as a result.
So 2 weeks ago, Washington, D.C., I think celebrated might be the right word, the 75th anniversary of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. It ended up being caught up in the swirls of all sorts of news regarding President Biden's age and health. But it's also an important inflection point, I think, for where the war stands right now and how the Western nations in the alliance are thinking about evolving geopolitical situation in the world. Give me your high-level reflection on the NATO summit and what you took away from how leaders were speaking and what the sociology on the ground looked like during the summit in Washington.
Well, I think at a very high level, NATO is stuck. It doesn't actually know what its purpose is strategically. We once knew, when NATO was first formed, NATO's purpose was self-defense, collective defense against the Soviet military, which at the end of World War II was quite dominant numerically, as by comparison to the militaries in Western Europe, which had been quite devastated by World War II. And there was real concern that the Soviet Red Army would continue marching westward if it were not opposed by a strong defense that had to include the United States. And that remained the fundamental purpose of NATO throughout the rest of the Cold War. Collective defense, a strong counterbalance to Soviet military power that would enable an effective diplomacy. And diplomacy is most often effective when it is coupled with strong military capabilities. But with the end of the Cold War, when NATO had 16 nations as members, NATO was left asking itself, well, what do we do now? Because the Soviet military was no longer there. The Warsaw Pact was gone. Russia was a shell of its former self, very little capability to threaten anybody militarily at the time. So what does NATO do? Does it go away? Does it change? Do we create some sort of new European security architecture that would include the Russians and as a result create stability, bring the Russians inside the tent with a stake in preserving the system rather than undermining it? And what happened was NATO ultimately opted for a different course. It said, well, the European security architecture is going to be NATO. Europe will be whole, free, and at peace, meaning everybody's going to be a member of NATO. They're all going to be liberal, democratic, market capitalist states in their political systems. And, oh, by the way, the Russians aren't going to be a part of this. They're going to be on the outside. And I think our assumption at the time was that Russia was in long-term decline, that, of course, it wouldn't like this arrangement, but it wouldn't be able to do anything about it and would eventually reconcile itself to that reality. Well, I think that proved wrong. Russia did not reconcile itself to the reality of NATO becoming the pan-European security architecture, Russia grew more and more unhappy with NATO's eastward expansion and eventually said, no more. You are crossing red lines. If NATO insists on Ukraine and Georgia becoming part of the alliance, this is a fundamental security threat to Russia's vital national interests. And we now have a situation where Russia has gone to war twice to prevent NATO's continued eastward expansion, first in Georgia in 2008, and then again in Ukraine, which has been playing out since 2014, but since 2022, of course, has been a full-scale military invasion of the country. And NATO has not adjusted. Our position at this point, as articulated again and again, both by the White House and by the NATO alliance itself, is we're not going to go to war with Russia. We won't put boots on the ground, but NATO is going to continue to expand, and Ukraine and Georgia will one day, date yet to be determined, become members of the NATO alliance. Well, those positions are not compatible with one another. Either you have to say, yeah, we're going to continue to expand because Ukraine's security is of vital interest to the United States, and therefore we must go to war to protect it. Or you say, no, it's not a vital interest, and we're not going to undertake a treaty obligation to go to war in the event that it is invaded. But right now we're trying to keep a foot in both camps. NATO won't fight the Russians directly, but it will undertake a treaty commitment at some point to defend Ukraine if necessary by going to war. And this summit didn't grapple with that. They attempted to walk a line between outright saying, here's a membership action plan for Ukraine to join, but also did not back down on its insistence that Ukraine would one day be a part of the alliance. So they added some new language that was meant to reassure the Ukrainians without actually committing the alliance to fight on Ukraine's behalf by saying Ukraine's path toward NATO is irreversible. Right. So we're going to...
Do these diplomats like treat these words like incantations? Like if you calibrate the words just right, you can have your cake and eat it too?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Sure. Wordsmithing is a part of all of this. Yeah. There's, constructive ambiguity in trying to find a path that, advances your political and diplomatic goals, but still leaves you wiggle room on these things. So this is what they came up with this time. But you can only dodge this fundamental issue for so long. The Russians have said, hey, guess what? This is vital to us. We're going to war to prevent this. So NATO is going to have to think hard about what its fundamental purposes are. And the United States is going to have to think, I think, very hard about what NATO does for American national interests. Is it, in fact, focused on making America more secure and more prosperous, or not? What is the purpose of this alliance relative to what matters to American national interests in the 2020s?
So there is a temptation, and an accurate one, I think, or a valuable one in American foreign policy circles to treat, America as one sort of pillar of NATO, and then sort of vaguely gesture to Europe as the other category. But it's, there's limitations to that unit of analysis. Is there any meaningful tension or discrepancies between how the British or the Germans or the French are thinking strategically about the future of the alliance, maybe even the Turks? Like, do you think that diving deeper than just Europe as a category is valuable to better understand the dynamics inside of NATO?
Oh, we have to.
Yeah.
Within the alliance, there's far more diversity than we would like to pretend.
Yeah.
Our line has been NATO is more united than it has been in many, many decades.
Yeah.
But I think just below that, the surface unity that you see, there's a great deal of variation in how states view the threats that they are encountering, the utility of the NATO alliance for their own particular interests. And we have to understand that diversity. We have to understand where various member states are coming from on all of this, because the United States itself has got to do a better job of setting priorities in the world. I think the beginning of wisdom in foreign policy is the recognition that we can't do everything. We have to prioritize what's most important, what's vital, what's less important, what's nice to do.
But if you believe in scarcity and prioritization, you don't believe in American exceptionalism. That's what I hear about this stuff from every neocon in DC.
Well, American exceptionalism is not the same thing as magic.
No, I'm pretty sure I heard that it was magic.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't have infinite resources. We don't have infinite capabilities. That's just the reality. Yeah. And so as a result, we have to decide what's most important. And right now we're in a situation where we have an enormous number of challenges in the world, and we have to decide what's most vital, what's less vital, what's nice to do. And again, that's not popular politically. Nobody likes to say, hey, look, we have to eat our broccoli here. We have to recognize that we can't do everything. When you don't recognize that you can't do everything, you overextend yourself. Yeah. You wind up in massive deficits, as we're in right now. You end up spread all over the world. And you don't have the resources or the focus necessary to deal with what's most important. So what do we need NATO to do right now, in my opinion? We need Europe to be an effective counterbalance, a counterweight to other powers in a world that is becoming more multipolar. Mm-hmm. The United States is not profited by a situation where the Europeans are subordinate to the United States, where we basically provide them with the umbrella of our security, and they do more or less what we would like them to do in the world, but they don't really pull much of their own weight, and they don't play a role as an independent counterweight. And we can't afford that anymore.
Yeah, there's sort of names on a coalition letter, but that's
right.
It, right?
Right. That's politically useful, but does it actually matter in trying to achieve a balance of power in this world? And right now it doesn't, and that has to change. The Europeans are going to have more strategic autonomy. That means the United States is going to have to loosen the degree of control that it has over Europe. We don't like that idea, but we're going to have to get used to it, because we can't have the Europeans playing a more influential role as a counterweight in this world if we're not also willing to allow them greater strategic autonomy than we have to date. And again, was the NATO summit talking about these issues? No, it was not. But these are the kinds of things that we have to be talking about with the Europeans quite seriously moving forward.
So I want to get your temperature check on the current state of mind of the Ukrainians and the Russians. Let's start with the Russians. What exactly does Putin want right now? Where would you say his headspace is at in terms of his goals with the war as they stand right now? I think this is one of the things that's so missing in Washington, is because you basically get chased out of any room if you acknowledge that Russia operates as an independent, rational state actor. You can disagree with the decisions they're making. You can even say that they are engaging in deeply immoral acts, but they have an interest and they're prosecuting it. And so understanding how they think about their own incentives is really important. And it's foolish that DC doesn't do that often enough. So how would you describe it at this moment in time?
Well, I think we have to be very cautious and humble when we think about our ability to get inside Putin's head and to understand his perceptions and what he's thinking. it's important to try to do, but it's a difficult thing to do. And I think we have to do it with a great deal of humility. That's number one. Number two, you can make some informed inferences based on analysis of what he has said over the years and what he's done over the years. And I think when you do that, I think you come away with an impression that he has a very good sense of the threats that he believes the United States and NATO have posed toward Russia. And he's talked a lot about this, right? He looks back at what the West has done over the past several decades, and he sees it as aggressive. Looking at what happened in Kosovo and the Balkans, what happened in Ukraine and Georgia, the degree to which the United States immersed itself in the internal politics of Russia itself. And I think Putin also is convinced that the West has misled him personally, that it has not fulfilled commitments that he believed we had made. Now, our side of the story is very different. We have very different perceptions of what we did, what our intentions were, what Russia did, and all of this. But to say that here are Putin's perceptions is not to say that those perceptions are justified or right. It's not to sympathize with them. It's really to try to understand them so that you get a better sense of what's driving Russian behavior. Now, I think what he is looking for is a grand strategic negotiation with the United States first and foremost, but with the West writ large as well. I think he realizes that Russia can't conquer all of Ukraine. It's a vast country territorially. There are vast portions of Ukraine that will fight tooth and nail in a guerrilla movement, if necessary, against any occupation force that's there, that extends beyond the Donbass area, beyond parts of Ukraine that have been, culturally and linguistically closer to Russia than the western parts of Ukraine. So I don't think his ambition is to have Russian tanks roll all the way to the Polish border or beyond, as is often alleged. I think he realizes that's beyond Russia's capability to try to undertake. But I do think he wants, number one, to make sure that NATO's eastward expansion ends, and that it does not include Ukraine, and that whatever is left of Ukraine at the end of this war is not some sort of base for American military equipment that in turn could threaten Russia in some substantial way. That's number one. Beyond that, I think he's got himself a big security problem in Europe. The Russian conventional military can't begin to contend with a 32-state NATO alliance, with long borders with the Russian Federation, military technology that really is beyond what Russia can offer, and economies and populations that dwarf Russia's overall. And he can't contend with that threat by winning in Ukraine or conquering NATO member states. He's going to have to reach some sort of understanding with the West. And if he can't, then Russia's going to have to rely on its nuclear arsenal to a much greater degree than it has. I think we're probably headed toward a situation, if we don't reach some sort of understanding between the West and Russia on all of this, where Europe is renuclearized in ways that it has not been since the INF Treaty, the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, was signed under Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987. We thought we had turned the page on that chapter of history. Well, it's coming back if we don't find a way to reach a mutually acceptable understanding about European security. Does Putin want that? I think he does. But I think he's also convinced that the powers that have been in the West to this point have no interest in that sort of negotiation. So there's a lot of suspicion on his part, deep mistrust. I think he's felt that he's been lied to over the years, much the way we feel that we've been lied to by the Russians on this. So overcoming those suspicions, overcoming that mistrust is going to be a formidable challenge. But if we're willing to entertain the possibility of some sort of diplomatic understanding, new rules of the game, not dissimilar to the kind of rules of the game that we had during the Cold War, that yes, are backed by military strength, yes, are backed by robust European military capabilities, but are coupled with serious diplomacy, much the way that Ronald Reagan did it in the 1980s. He certainly negotiated from a position of strength, but he also took advantage of opportunities and wisely, I think, reached accords that made everybody more secure. And I don't think that Putin is opposed to that in principle. He just doesn't think that he's got an interlocutor in the West that's willing to pursue that.
So on the flip side, how would you describe the Ukrainian mentality right now? We're taping this just a couple days after President Zelensky called President Trump and, used language about an end to the war. He might have been playing to his audience in that case, but certainly an interesting development. Are the Ukrainians thinking rationally, irrationally? Are they hoping to wrap this up? How would you describe their mental state right now?
Well, I think if I were in the Ukrainian shoes, I would be very concerned about the situation. The Biden administration's approach to Ukraine has been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And, we're going to do this for as long as it takes, leaving out the definition of whatever it is. So our goals have been quite vague, but we have, to this point, really not been very interested in advancing negotiations. And I think from Ukraine's point of view, I think it has good reason to believe that its negotiating leverage may be eroding over time. Why? Well, it's losing a lot of population. I mean, it's at a big disadvantage when it comes to its population relative to Russia. It can't afford to be losing capable soldiers at the rate that it has been for very much longer. Number two, I think it recognizes that popular support of the West for continuing to provide tens of billions of dollars of aid indefinitely is eroding over time. And Ukraine is completely dependent on the United States and Europe for keeping its economy afloat, keeping its government going, and getting the arms and ammunition it needs to continue the war. So they've got to be asking themselves, what do we do if it looks like the gravy train is going to start to end for them? Now, it's also, from Zelensky's point of view, he's got a domestic political problem. He's got a hardline nationalist right that does not want to negotiate, does not want to end this war. They simply want to continue fighting until the Russians are driven off of all Ukrainian territory.
Has that right waxed or waned in influence since the beginning of the war?
Hard to say. I'm not sure that...
I'm assuming a lot of those people are fighting soldiers, many of whom are dying. So in
that's right.
terms.
Yeah, right. It's very hard to say. A lot of this information is opaque in a country that's at war. That's quite normal. These are variables that matter a lot to Ukrainian national security, and they're not going to make it easy for anybody to understand what's going on, because people that wish them ill might well take advantage of some of this. That said, if you're going to advance toward some sort of settlement, if you recognize that that's the best alternative you have, to negotiate now before your leverage diminishes even more, to negotiate before your country collapses altogether, and then you're not in a negotiation. You're in a position where Russia dictates terms of a settlement, and they don't want to be in that kind of situation. You need some help politically from the United States. You need the United States to some degree to be the bad guy, meaning Zelensky needs to be able to point to pressure from the United States in some way to deal with his political right, to say to them, hey, look, not up to me. I'm getting all kinds of pressure from Washington. We have to deal with the situation as we're facing it. So we're going to have to understand the reality means we need to negotiate with the Russians. So the kinds of pressure that the United States is putting on Ukraine because of the dynamics of our electoral situation right now can be useful, I think, for Zelensky in trying to negotiate his own situation inside Ukraine. Now, I won't pretend to know what Zelensky himself is thinking in all of this, but if I were in his shoes, I would certainly be talking to Donald Trump and trying to understand better where he's coming from.
Based on the situation as it currently stands, let's assume President Trump gets elected in November. What would a resolution to this war that allows all sides to save face look like?
Well, I think you have to understand that Ukraine's not going to get at the negotiating table what it can't do on the battlefield. Meaning, if you can't drive the Russians off of the territory they're occupying now with armed force, you're not going to drive them off that territory in a negotiation. Now, is that a regrettable situation? Absolutely. Does it require the Ukrainians legally and formally to cede territory to the Russians and say, you know, the Donbass is now part of the Russian Federation and we recognize that? No, I don't think so. There are lots of wars that have ended with a de facto change of territory that is not legally recognized by the parties or their supporters. Korea is an example of that. Lots of other examples in Cyprus, etc. The United States itself never recognized the incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. Every map that we produced during the Cold War had a little note saying the United States does not recognize that the Baltic states are part of the Soviet Union. So there's a lot that you can do there. And I don't think that ending this war really pivots on some sort of territorial swap. What it does depend on, I think, is enshrining Ukraine's geopolitical neutrality into law in some way. That's been a fundamental Russian demand from the start. I think it's been, since even before this invasion began, the key to finding some stable situation in Ukraine and in Europe more broadly. So that's going to have to be a part of it. Now, should the United States make that concession up front? No, we should not. Of course not. You need things in return for those sort of concessions in any kind of negotiation.
Sorry, just explain a little bit of how that works. It'd be part of the treaty language, Ukraine shall not, the United States will not acquiesce to the accession of Ukraine to NATO. Like, would it be that kind of thing? Or?
Well, there are lots of different ways you can handle it. You could have some sort of peace settlement that gets ratified and approved by the UN Security Council, just to pick an example. It would then have the force of law, and various UN Security Council permanent members would then have a stake in upholding that. Ukraine could also put in its constitution, which it once had, language saying that it is geopolitically neutral and will not be a part of any military alliance. On top of that, the United States could agree to some arms control measures, which I think are ultimately going to have to be a part of this. We had at one point a treaty on conventional forces in Europe that limited national conventional force ceilings. Various states could only hold so many tanks, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's going to have to be a part of this. And that will be a difficult negotiation. But I think we're going to have a situation where there are caps on what the Ukrainians can hold in their military. There are caps on what the Russians can deploy on Russian territory opposite Ukraine's borders. And there are going to have to be some limits on what foreign forces can deploy in Ukraine as well. Now, we know how to do this. We've done this before successfully. We've negotiated it. It will be a difficult negotiation, but I think that's going to have to be a part of an ultimate settlement in all of this. And I think we're going to have to include nuclear weapons. And one of the announcements that occurred on the margins of the NATO summit that a lot of people didn't focus on, but I think is quite significant, the United States and Germany announced that we're going to be putting what essentially are intermediate range missile forces on German territory, again, for the first time since the mid-1980s when the INF Treaty banned them. And the Russians are, of course, moving nuclear weapons into Belarus. And we're headed toward a situation where Europe is likely to be on a nuclear hair trigger again. A very volatile situation. The amount of warning time that you have for these sorts of systems that once they're launched and impact is measured in a handful of minutes. It's not a lot of time to be making, sound.
It's like five or 6 minutes, right?
Yeah. And you in a situation like that, you've got to be worried about nuclear decapitation and first strike damage, and you get into launch it or lose it kinds of situations based on potentially erroneous technical information that you don't have time to check out, because if you're wrong, you might not be around anymore to make those decisions. That's not in anybody's interest, quite honestly. It doesn't make Europe safer. It doesn't make Russia or the United States more secure. We've got to find a way of dealing with all of that. And these are issues that, while not directly related to Ukraine, they're a critical context that we have to take into consideration in finding a way forward here that brings about broader stability in Europe.
So understanding that there's disagreement even amongst more realist folks on the right on the premise of this question, if the orienting foreign policy of the right for the next 20 to 30 years is going to be grand strategic competition with China, it seems to me that a very high up item on the checklist in order to prepare for that is to de-escalate conflict with other near-peer competitors, especially in the region. Is there any way after this war that the United States could normalize relations with the Russians to the extent that good sense would militate if we are going to be in that great power competition with China?
Well, yeah, and I think this is a critical issue for us. It used to be that the gospel in Washington was that we needed better relations with Moscow and with Beijing independently than they had with each other.
Right.
That's not where we are right now.
Yeah.
Not only do Moscow and Beijing have much better relations with each other than we have with them, but they are moving toward a strategic entente.
Yeah.
They're not yet at an alliance phase where they have mutual defense commitment to one another, but they are certainly cooperating strategically with each other against the United States. That's not in our interest at all. The Chinese by themselves, I think, are a quite formidable, probably unprecedentedly formidable challenger to the United States. But when you add to them, the world's largest landmass in Russia, one of its largest depositories of strategic minerals and energy resources.
Every resource deficit that China has,
right.
Russia complements.
That's right. And the world's largest nuclear arsenal. And the Russians have a larger nuclear arsenal numerically than we do. It makes no sense for us to drive those two together against us. Now, can the United States normalize relations with Russia? Yeah, I think we can. That doesn't mean we're going to bring them over to our side. It doesn't mean we're going to drive a wedge between China and Russia to the degree that they become hostile toward one another. But I think we could have, a return to normality with Russia, meaning, there will still be aspects of competition there. Absolutely. There are going to be a lot of things that we disagree on. Yes. But we can put in place a framework that allows us to manage those disagreements, to minimize the volatility in the relationship, to actually restore diplomatic channels of communication, which right now are almost entirely gone. We're just not talking to the Russians, and that's not normal. That, I think, helps our cause. And it means, in turn, that the incentives that we have inadvertently created for Russia to work against us with China will diminish. And some of the more natural frictions, a more normal relationship between Russia and China, which won't be an alliance. It's not going to be hostile. It'll be somewhere in the middle. Where
they have territorial disagreements.
Sure, yes. And they have suspicions, et cetera. They don't agree on everything. They have different strategic interests. That would, I think, be very much in our interest to see. China and Russia aren't going to be enemies. We're not going to make them enemies. But can they have a more normal relationship where they have their disagreements and aren't working hand in glove against us in the world? Yes, I think we can. That should be one of our goals.
You've been on the inside of the executive branch and have seen America's strategic culture from a variety of vantage points for almost 30 years. Just give me your reflections on the state of it right now. Is it as bad as you've ever seen it, just in terms of the impracticality and the foolhardiness? And what do you see as paths to reforming, for lack of a better term, your industry? Because it seems to be in bad shape right now.
Well, yeah, I think the relationship between Moscow and Washington is much worse than it has been at any point in my lifetime. And it's very dangerous.
Inclusive of the Cold War?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I think it is very dangerous, very volatile, in part because the United States, I think, has decided that the danger of nuclear conflict with Russia is much diminished. I think...
And is there any good reason?
At least subconsciously. Well, I think, the end of the Cold War, I think, caused us to exhale. And we thought, okay, been there, done that. We didn't have a nuclear war. We won. The good guys won. And it would be completely irrational for anyone to launch a nuclear war. Therefore, it won't happen. We don't really have to worry about it. And I think...
is this like a kind of like social presentism? Like much like a social activist would say, well, racism and sexism, those are from the 20th century. Nuclear war, that's a 20th century thing.
Well, to some degree. Yeah, to some degree, I think subconsciously that's going on. And I think we need a healthy respect for the dangers that we're in the nuclear era. The nuclear era hasn't gone away. Those weapons are still there. We have not destroyed them or eliminated them. And one of the things that allowed us to manage the rivalry with the Soviet Union was a mutual recognition that we were co-hostages, so to speak, in the nuclear era, that one side could not be secure if the other side did not have at least a baseline level of security itself. So we each had a stake in the other side's security. We each had a stake in the other side's stability, because the alternative was we could wind up on a path toward a confrontation that would destroy us both. And to a great degree, I think we've forgotten that reality. I think we've become, to some degree, complacent. And I think the Ukraine war is an example of what happens when you lose touch with that fundamental reality. You start thinking, hey, we can defeat Russia militarily, right? Perhaps even break up the Russian Federation, to decolonize it, as some people call it.
Max.
Right, yeah. And that, when you start thinking in those terms, to me, it's a sign that you've lost touch with that fundamental reality that Russia is a nuclear power. You're not going to defeat them militarily, because they have the ultimate card to play to prevent that. And it's not in our interest to test would they in fact use these nuclear weapons. If you're really going to test that, you have to ask yourself, why? What is so important to American security that you want to tiptoe up to the brink of some sort of nuclear catastrophe? There better be a really compelling reason. And the really compelling reason is what? Nobody has articulated that I can see. There are ways that we can secure our own country, ensure our own prosperity, that manage our differences with the Russians and greatly reduce the risks that we're going to go to war with one another. And we need to be thinking hard about how to do that.
For our members only section, I'm going to ask George the question we always ask our guests, which is, what's the thing they're paying attention to that no one else is at this moment in time? In order to become a member, you can go to our YouTube channel and just search American Moment and you'll find it. And you can become either a truther or a statesman. And that gets you these episodes 24 hours early, as well as various other members' perks and invitations to events here in DC. We are having a great time doing various podcast events live here in Washington. So once again, you can become a truther or a statesman in order to access these special members-only segments.
If you're listening to this, you're almost certainly a highly sophisticated news consumer, but even the most dogged of DC politicos need a news aggregator to help them out. We're big fans of Upward News here at American Moment. Ari David has actually been a previous guest on this show. We highly recommend you check out that episode. But Upward.news is a way that our team keeps in touch with all of the crazy news stories going on around the world. Your Twitter feed is not necessarily 100% reliable to get a proper cross-section of everything going on that matters. Upward News is a fantastic young media startup that is really putting together fantastic newsletters and social media content that helps people digest the news, especially if you're tired of being on the phone with your parents and explaining news stories to them multiple times a week because you're the politico in the family. I highly recommend encouraging them to follow Upward.news. They do a free 5-minute daily email that you can sign up for at readupward.com, or even better, www.ihatefakenews.com. It's time for a palate cleanse from politicos, punch bowls, and pucks. Try Upward News today. We highly recommend it. Ari's an incredibly smart patriot, and they're a new player on the block focused on cutting through the noise and delivering smart analysis. Please check them out.
George, how can people keep up with everything that you're working on?
The Quincy Institute website is a good place to look. It's online, quincyinst.com, and I think that's probably the best place to follow what I'm publishing and various interviews that I'm giving. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. You are someone who teaches for us all the time. We greatly appreciate that, and one of the most sober and intelligent voices on Russia and foreign policy in general in DC. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Hopefully you enjoyed that episode. We certainly enjoyed taping it. George is often demonized here in Washington, D.C., but I think if you actually listen to what he has to say, it's very hard to find much to disagree with. He is absolutely brilliant and teaches for us all the time here at American Moment. It's a joy to have him on. As always, be sure to go to AmericanMoment.org, see the backlog of this podcast. Be sure to become a member by becoming a truther or a statesman on our YouTube channel in order to get the episodes 24 hours early, as well as seeing special members-only segments and getting invites to events here in Washington, D.C. You can rate and review the podcast. In fact, I highly encourage you to do so on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, share our clips everywhere, follow us on X at ammoment.org. There's lots of ways to interact with what we're doing, and we always appreciate it. It's an exciting season. Reach out to us if you're thinking about getting involved here in Washington, D.C. There's a lot that needs to be done, and we need bodies in order to step into the fray to help govern this country. It's a joy to be back here in the chair after a crazy couple of weeks. And we're just grateful to all of you. So we'll see you next week.
Moment of Truth is an American Moment podcast taped at the Conservative Partnership Campus Studios and is produced by Jake Mercier, Jared Cummings, Tiffany Kutris, and Matthew Pearson. Our intro song is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich, and our website is americanmoment.org.